Great picture.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Devorah Margolin, and I am delighted to welcome you to our ongoing counterterrorism lecture series. Today, I am joined by three amazing speakers who will be talking about the Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan, or Islamic State Khorasan. First and foremost, we are joined by Amira Jadoon and Andrew Mines, author of the new book, an excellent book, which will be found in the chat function. So if you can buy your own copies of this great book, The Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Strategic Alliances and Rivalries. And they're going to talk to us today about ISK, its current posture 2 years under the Taliban, and Taliban CT efforts against the group. Again, the link will be provided to those interested. Dr. Amira Jadoon is an assistant professor at Clemens University, and prior to Clemens, she worked at the U.S. Military Academy at the West Point, and she holds external appointments at ICCT, The Hague, the Stimson Center, George C. Marshall Center, and is an incoming associate editor of the European Journal of International Security. Most importantly, in 2022, she was named by CSIS as one of 50 honorees of the U.S. National Security and Foreign Affairs Leadership List. We're also joined today by Andrew Mines. Andrew is a program specialist at the Asia Center at the United States Institute for Peace. He previously worked as a research analyst at USIP's Program on Violent Extremism. Prior to joining USIP, he was a research fellow at the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University, where I had the pleasure of working with him daily. Finally, we are joined by Aaron Zelin. Dr. Zelin is the Richard Borrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where his research focuses on Sunni jihadi groups in North Africa and Syria, as well as the trends of foreign fighters and online jihadism. He'll be speaking today about ISKP's external operations, and link to his most recent article is also found in the chat box. We'll begin with Amira and Andrew before turning over to Aaron. A little light housekeeping before we do. If you are on the Zoom, please use the Q&A function to ask questions. I have a handy tablet right here, and I will see your questions. And if you're watching on our live stream or on YouTube, please send your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That's policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. I'd hand it over to you. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you, Dev, for that kind introduction. Corey, could we have our slides up, please? Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much. You can go ahead to the first slide, which is the agenda slide. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, our online audience. And of course, a big thanks to the Washington Institute for hosting us and helping us talk about some of or relay some of the findings regarding Islamic State Khorasan. So as Dev mentioned, we released our book earlier this year in which we explore ISK's historical evolution. And in the book, we focus on identifying the sources of ISK's resilience. Now, today, though, we will focus on ISK's current posture, specifically under the Taliban rule since their takeover in 2021. Sorry, I was just checking the chat. So here's the plan. After a quick refresher on ISK's underlying sources of resilience, we will discuss some of the key ways in which ISK's observable behavior has shifted over the past 2 years. So, for example, its media and outreach, its targeting priorities, tactics, and also some of the geographical shifts that we can observe in its activity, but specifically its attacks. And collectively, these provide us insights into ISK's evolution, but also how it adapts given the current environment. Then I'll hand it over to Andrew, who will discuss the Taliban's crackdown against ISK, specifically in 2023, but also prior to that, and really to discuss how successful have these efforts been and what may they mean for ISK's future trajectory. Next slide, please. Oops, all right, thank you. So I just want to take a brief moment to mention that some of the insights that we'll mention today is not just based on what we are observing today or the past 2 years, but it really draws upon the work that Andrew and I have done independently, collaboratively, but also with some other very hardworking and intelligent people who have also worked on ISK. So the insights that we provide today, or the analysis that we give today, is really a combination of all the work that we've done in the past, and we'll aim to provide you a holistic overview, but in the context of what we have observed in prior years. Next slide. So the central question which motivated our book was the puzzle surrounding ISK's tenacious grip in the region. Now, currently ISK is in its 9th year of survival after emerging in 2015. And I think we can all appreciate that ISK faced a lot of challenges upon arrival in 2015. The environment, it was sort of already inundated with militant groups. And at the time of its emergence in 2015, there was a US-led coalition in Afghanistan, and the Pakistani army had gained significant experience in tackling terrorism. But what we saw is, despite all these challenges and subsequent losses, today the group retains its ability to inflict violence, target state and civilian actors, and also threaten international security. In addition, it's also recruiting from across the region. So, next slide, please. So within our book, our main argument is that ISK's strategic selection of alliances, as well as its rivalries with local groups, have really been central to not just its initial rise, but also its ability to overcome its losses and then resurge post-2021. Specifically, its approach of building a network of cross-border alliances and provoking dominant groups, obviously most notably the Taliban, really allowed it to first localize its jihad, gain local experience, recruits, and also facilitators through alliances, and finally, of course, differentiate its brand from other strong players, such as the Taliban. Now, I mentioned this today because, of course, we wrote a book about it, but also because it's really relevant today. Now, ISK continues to work with groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and ETIM for various activities, including recruitment and planning and conducting attacks. At the same time, we see that ISK's rivalry with the Taliban has provided some really meaningful dividends, which we are starting to see now or in the past 2 years. As the Taliban's most capable and resolved challenger, it's well positioned now to attract a diverse array of militants, whether they're opportunistic or they're disgruntled, but also potentially new recruits and sympathizers who may find a global jihadist platform appealing for various reasons, whether this is within the region or beyond. Next slide. So the final point that I want to talk about before I hand it over to Andrew is ISK's media and its outreach and its evolution over its entire history. So if we examine ISK's, its messages, its themes, its content, the magnitude of it, the content, it can help us gain insights into how ISK has adapted, because often what's happening on the ground is also reflected in terms of what ISK puts out there. So in general, ISK's narratives and media operations have evolved in 3 key waves. This is our framing, not ISK, which reflects its shifting priorities, needs, and the strategic environment. During each of these waves, what we see is that ISK adjusts its narrative in response to its territorial dominance, its organizational power and goals, capabilities, but also what its strategic objectives are, given the environment at the time. So the first wave was the period between ISK's emergence until its first operational decline. Here, we're all familiar with the sort of themes that we saw. It was all anti-Taliban, but also there was more narrative and images and pictures about life in the caliphate, right? So this was when they were trying to gain territorial control and establish it subsequently. The second wave was when ISK struggled to remain relevant after significant losses. But also while the United States and the Afghan Taliban were negotiating for a peace deal. And here we see that ISK as it experienced these losses, its narratives lost any specific geographical references, right? Because they weren't controlling territory anymore. And they also began to link the Taliban directly to the US, calling it a puppet or acting on behalf of the international community later. ISK also refocused its efforts on instilling fear and signaling its resolve for survival. So again, it had experienced significant losses. So at this time, we also saw that ISK shifted its targeting priorities more towards civilians. Now, the third and current wave emerged soon after the US's unconditional withdrawal and also the takeover by the Taliban and the collapse of the Afghan government in August 2021. This, from our perspective, is ISK's most aggressive and sophisticated campaign. So its outreach and propaganda dissemination has reached unprecedented levels, not just in terms of form, quantity, but also the number of languages. So in one of the pieces by, I think, Abdul Said and Tori Hamming, they mentioned that in one of their reports, al-Azim reported that in the past 12 months, which was the first year under Taliban rule, they had released over 800 audio and video outputs and about 175 books. That is a large quantity of propaganda that a group is disseminating. And what we see now is beyond vilifying the Taliban, at times calling it Biden's new army, much of the messaging highlights state repression of Muslims in China, India, Pakistan, Central Asia, portraying ISK as the main defender of these people against these regimes. At the same time, it also engages in commentary on topics outside of the immediate region. For example, if there are incidents of Quran burning in Europe. And lastly, ISK also added 4 additional magazines to its publication portfolio, which includes an English language magazine, Voice of Khorasan. I think this is concerning because it brings up questions and concerns about the extent to which ISK is trying to appeal to recruits or sympathizers outside of the immediate region. So with this campaign, we see more sophisticated audience segmentation, where ISK is speaking to the specific grievances of particular audiences, and its commentary is more timely. So this sophisticated multilingual marketing campaign continues to position ISK as the main and only legitimate jihadist organizations for dissatisfied populations. And with that, I will hand it over to Andrew to discuss some of the operational side of things. And next slide, please.
Thanks, Amira. And thank you, Dev, Aaron, and really the whole Washington Institute for hosting us today, for hosting this forum and giving us a platform to share our findings with you. I really do encourage you to take a look at the book and consider buying it. It is expensive, but we do promise that it's packed full of data and findings from the last several years. I've worked with Amira on this project in Amira before we joined forces in 2018. So I just want to provide a quick note that in terms of my affiliation, I'm not here representing the United States Institute of Peace. I'm here as a beloved former colleague of Dev's and as someone who's worked with Amira, obviously on this book publication and then others that were mentioned at the start of this presentation. So that's the capacity I'm here today in. I'm going to go very quickly through ISK's kind of adjustments, but also some continuations of activity the group's taken on since its founding and officially in 2015. So really look at this past 2 years under the Taliban, some shifts in their operational behavior that have occurred, some longstanding operational behavioral activities that the group's undertaken, so some constants in there, and then kind of focus on what's become of this latest surge in Taliban counter-ISK operations that have drawn a lot of media attention over the last several months, which really began in earnest earlier this year, and what we might be able to glean in terms of what those operations have yielded. Next slide, please. In terms of ISIS-K's overall violent operations since the start of the Taliban's so-called rule of Afghanistan since 2021 August, we have a really unique position here, just over 2 years of data that we can leverage, and also just observations on what ISIS-K has done since the Taliban took over. So I really want to run through all these things, and the word I'm going to use here is insurgency, because I think there's a switch that flips in people's minds when they hear that word. and it helps us to really expand our appreciation for what ISIS-K has always been about and what they've been doing certainly since the Taliban took over. So first up there, leading up to the Taliban takeover, the US withdrawal, and then through that period in August, September is a phase of economic warfare that came to define a lot of IS affiliates across the globe, but certainly perhaps ISIS-K right up there at the top and leading the charge of economic warfare. Destroying electricity pylons that were servicing different urban centers. Attacks on oil tankers is another example of what ISIS-K was doing in this period, but really expanding the strength of its insurgency and its ability to combat state-provided functions. So that's one. Two, this is also a new word activity that ISIS-K has undertaken. Obviously, there were attempts on international targets before the withdrawal, before the takeover, but this has really stepped up since the Taliban takeover in August 2021 in terms of attacks on the international presence, including foreign nationals and NGOs, but also those cross-border attacks that have marked the media cycle there at the bottom, number 6. So not just attacks in the country on foreign presence, but also across the border in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Iran, and Pakistan. So those two kind of in combination play on similar strategic logics, but really stepping it up since 2021. Also, number 3, their high profile assassinations, yet targeted killings have been a feature of ISIS-K since they were founded in 2015, but we're talking very high level assassinations, provincial governors, top ideologues, individuals with heavy security details in some cases and locked in compounds. So taking on really extensive risk and really high risk, high reward operations in terms of going after figures like some of those listed right here. Fourth there is rural guerrilla warfare. And this has really come to define ISIS-K's competition in areas where it has historically enjoyed stronger presence, stronger support, and has, from the group's own perception, really considered a heartland for since 2015, again, since it was founded, but really competing for those populations that it considers to be its core strongholds. And so that was certainly a feature of the early months after the Taliban takeover, and has kind of featured not consistently, but certainly through ebbs and flows since then. So competing for the strongholds, for the heartland that it once considered its own at its peak territorial holding days in 2015, 16, and a little bit in 2017. And finally, something that's very much been a feature consistently of ISIS-K, which is urban sectarian warfare. We're talking attacks on targets, soft and hard targets in urban areas like Kabul, notable expansions to other areas in the immediate aftermath of the withdrawal, but really expanding its targeting profile and doubling down on the sectarian agenda of any IS affiliate. This is across IS affiliates, but certainly is representative of ISIS-K. So you see across all of these different types of operations, an insurgency that's really trying to push and expand and test the boundaries of this latest phase for the country in general and what they're able to achieve in that period. Next slide, please. And just to show you where is this happening, and then how does that look in that top left slide there. I apologize if the image is a little fuzzy, but hopefully you can make it out. We've got in black those core strongholds that I mentioned before. Kabul, not necessarily a stronghold, but certainly a key operational area for ISIS-K historically. Nangarhar is certainly an operational stronghold, and a little bit in Kunar as well. But expanding beyond that, and for the most recent kind of year or two, the coalition had done a lot with some Taliban operations as well to limit ISIS-K during those 2015, 16, 17 expansion years, whittled away at the organization and pushed it back into that black area there. We're seeing in the last months and certainly the last 2 years, a re-expansion, and in some cases, new expansion into new operational areas along the north, along the border with Central Asian countries, and along the northeast into the north of Pakistan, into the tribal areas, into KP province there. Historically, where ISIS-K has leveraged thousands of recruits and has really steeped into some of the alliances that Amira discussed at the start of the presentation. And so expanding its networks and its operational behavior north and east and trying to push out and stretch the insurgency as it's going through this latest phase. And then this is in the bottom right there, you'll see just a map of where ISIS-K and also al-Qaeda, I think is interesting to present alongside ISIS-K there, about where ISIS-K has built new, reopened old, or cemented existing training camps and safe houses in different areas around Afghanistan. You'll notice they sit in much of the same area as their operational behavior along the north again, and then along the east and northeast there. And so really trying to cement its positions, notably in those key border areas where you can leverage alliances, where you can bring in recruits and leverage kind of cross-border channels of migration. And on here, I'll note that there's thank you for sharing that link in the chat. Report I put out recently with Insight and George Washington University examines in great detail how the Northeast, that corridor between Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular, is where a majority of foreign fighters from certainly the United States, but also European countries as well, used to land, arrive, meet with operational landing pads, and then shepherd across into Afghanistan. So Pakistan and Afghanistan, you can't dissociate the two when you talk about a foreign fighter potential surge and a foreign fighter presence. And I know Aaron will have much more to say on that shortly afterwards, but I just wanted to flag that there. We cannot separate those two. The push north is certainly concerning as well. Less American and less European transit historically, but there's always room for change, and I'd be concerned there. So I would just flag that too. Next slide, please. Now, what have the Taliban done about this? Since they took over August 2021, I think there was certainly this adjustment period, and a lot of people have commented about that adjustment period. How can the Taliban play a counterinsurgency role as former insurgents? And so there are interesting dynamics at play, certainly, but really we see in earnest a step up in targeted operations against key ISIS-K leaders this year. Before that, there had been operations against key pockets of ISIS-K strongholds. There was certainly a really heavy-handed approach to the Salafi population in Nangarhar right after the Taliban took over in 2021, and so that led to some pretty horrendous abuses of human rights, whether they were ISIS-K affiliates or not. It was a really awful crackdown on the population around Jalalabad and other areas. So, but this latest period, 2023 and on, largely focused on urban areas, on urban ISIS-K cells, on not the top leadership, so the governor level, but right underneath him and a little bit farther down on that level of leaders who are really hands-on when it comes to ISIS-K's military operations, their attacks in urban areas, certainly propagandists, top propagandists, also senior ideologues. And so there have been a number of successes that have whittled away at ISIS-K's ranks in short succession at the start of this year and over the course of the spring. Now, we haven't necessarily seen those sustained since. I think that's interesting to note. There have been one or two that are notable since then, but that tends to lend itself to some skepticism from the international community, and should, right? Which is ISIS-K's ranks are still swelled, but after that wave of operations, what is the Taliban's interests and abilities to really go after the group? So much to be discussed there. I hope we can get into some of it in the Q&A. Next slide, please. This is, and on the note, I just wanted to say quickly that this was a study that Amira, myself, and then a colleague of ours and good friend, Dr. Daniel Milton at West Point, put out in late last year on the effects of leadership decapitation efforts against ISIS-K and their attack operations. So really, we took a structure of looking at ISIS-K as an organization. Again, I mentioned this a little bit briefly, but hammering out what leaders were being targeted and applying a structure that we applied to ISIS-K's leadership. So 1 through 4, 1 being the top level, 2 being right underneath them, and 3 and 4 underneath that. 4 really being responsible for the day-to-day operations and command and control over attack cells and different units within ISIS-K. And so what we actually found, and so we applied that across district weeks. We were looking across the country. So attacks after a leader was targeted in the following week in the same district. Next slide, please. What we found was that the overall effect, ignore which leader was being targeted, ignore where they're being targeted. The overall effect was an increase in attacks following targeting against ISIS-K leaders. But when you break it down across those different levels, you see there's actually a bit more nuance to it. And there are these interesting dynamics, certainly when you look at that level of leaders right underneath the top leader, tier 2. We're talking about, again, heads of military operations, of bureaucratic structures that Islamic State methodology assigns to the organization and that its affiliates adopt. And so when you look at targeting against that level, that cohort, actually attacks in the same district the following week declined, both total attacks and attacks against state targets and civilian targets. Now there's a bit of an opposite effect when we look at really down to the ground level, that bottom level leadership level of again, people very hands-on in the day-to-day operations of the group. So there's actually a reverse effect there. So interesting to note, especially when we think about that former slide of, okay, the Taliban are targeting key ISIS-K ideologues, different key leaders. We've seen notably in 2023 also a decline in ISIS-K operations and violent operations. So there are different models, it's different environments, but certainly some interesting comparisons to make and some lessons learned to be drawn from the previous phase before the Taliban takeover and what the Taliban is doing now against ISIS-K. Next slide, please. And so when we think about that, lends itself to really some interesting insights, I think, when it comes to kinetic operations. And Amira and I have much more to say on that. Again, hopefully we can get to some of that in the Q&A. But when we think about what the international community is really able to do now, when kinetic options are certainly constrained, and you have to turn more to those non-kinetic approaches. From a PCVE lens, regional coordination, regional forums, regional partners are key, are critical. They have been since ISIS-K was first formed. A lot of the dynamics that strengthen ISIS-K, its ability to leverage cross-border alliances, transnational recruits, transnational ambition, can only be addressed with a regional lens, can only be addressed with regional solutions. And so bolstering partners at a regional level is certainly key. When we come to strategic communications, there are a number of dynamics and lessons learned from not just against ISIS-K, but the entire Islamic State global movement that should really be taken into account here, which is first, certainly exposing those say-do gaps. Amira mentioned life in the caliphate at the start. Those are some interesting say-do gaps between what the Islamic State is actually doing and what it says it's doing in its propaganda. And so exploiting the difference and that gap between the two. Also exploiting leadership turnover. This is something that has plagued ISIS-K since it was first founded. A lot of turnover at the highest levels and in the middle and lower levels. And so being able to, when it comes to the succession process and everybody's scrambling to take a role in the new, in what becomes of ISIS-K after leadership turnover, that's where you're really able to insert some uncertainty and to leverage some of those organizational dynamics. And then finally, humanitarian aid it needs to be considered very carefully, not as a leverage of counter ISIS-K operations, but certainly to address ISIS-K's position and posture vis-a-vis humanitarian aid and the international community, and to identify those risks and to really double down on, okay, what is our organization? What is our posture and ability to absorb risk when it comes to potential ISIS-K exploits and the risk there? And also to compete for key populations that are really missing out under Taliban rule. This is a desperate situation. It's only getting worse. And there are key populations that ISIS-K is vying for, it is competing for, that the international community, if the Taliban cannot provide this support, really needs to consider how we are providing support to those populations who ISIS-K is also competing for. So I'll stop there. I think that's the last slide. Next slide, please. I think that's the last slide. So I'll stop there, and Aaron, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure having you both on this panel, and really excited about your book, and everybody should buy it if they haven't already. I agree with everybody on the panel so far. And thanks again for Dev for moderating this panel. So today I'll be talking about the Islamic State Khorasan province, or ISKP's external operations and networks and cells abroad. This follows sort of a long list of jihadi groups historically going back the last 30 years now that have been involved in these types of activities, whether it's the Algerian Armed Islamic Group, al-Qaeda, of course, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Shabaab, and more recently with the Islamic State in both Syria and Libya. And of course, today we're now seeing ISKP adopting the same strategy in Afghanistan. Yet, unlike in many previous groups that relied on sort of stable safe havens to gain more time and space for planning and training, ISKP is actually going weaker in Afghanistan during the Taliban's second year in power, as already discussed by Amira and Andrew, while paradoxically expanding external operations capacity. This is a stark reminder, though, that Afghanistan under the Taliban remains a top vector for jihadist operations abroad, even if this time the Taliban is an enemy of ISKP, whereas in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Taliban and al-Qaeda were friendly. So in shifting from a local/regional focus to a more global posture, ISKP has pursued a two-pronged strategy related to this. The first one is an ongoing propaganda campaign. Unlike other IS provinces, quote unquote, ISKP has developed an independent media architecture via its Al-Azam Media Foundation, which has produced thus far content in Arabic, English, Farsi, Pashto, Tajik, Urdu, and Uzbek, as far as I'm aware. Besides the Taliban, this content has taken aim at a wide range of foreign targets from surrounding countries like India, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, to Middle Eastern heavyweight countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE, to, of course, the largest countries in the world like China, Russia, the US, as well as countries in the EU. The second prong consists of planning and carrying out attacks abroad, either directed, guided, or inspired by the organization. Although the Taliban has repeatedly claimed over the last 2+ years that Afghanistan will not be used as a base for such plots, data compiled by the Islamic State Select Worldwide Activity map project, which I've been directing now for the last almost year, indicates that the incident rate has actually only picked up since the Taliban has taken power. ISKP continues to carry out cross-border attacks inside of Pakistan, as noted earlier, but it has also previously launched cross-border rocket strikes against Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Interestingly, they've also successfully claimed responsibility for attacks in the Maldives twice in February and April 2020, as well as claiming one attack in Shiraz, Iran in October 2022, so almost a year ago now. And more recently, there was an attack in August this year. ISKP or IS didn't claim the attack, though the Iranian government claims it is related to ISKP. Corey, if you could show the map, please. So what this map shows is a number of things. It shows where there have been plots related to ISKP. It shows where there have been foreign fighter recruitment networks for individuals to go abroad, as well as fundraising efforts as well. So this should not be viewed as just an attack plot map, as a note of caution. That being said, since ISKP has been around, there have been 16 plots that have been interdicted by law enforcement globally. 3 in India, 4 in Iran, 3 in Germany, 1 in the Maldives, 1 in Pakistan, 1 in Qatar, and 3 in Turkey. 4 of these plots, should be noted, emerged before the Taliban took over Afghanistan, but the other 12 have happened now since then, 5 in 2022, and 7 so far this year. And of course, there's still another couple of months left. These findings indicate that the Taliban's, so-called counterterrorism efforts against the group locally are limited to its own security needs than necessarily helping out with other nations abroad, even though, as many who focus on these issues closely know, that the group has been vigorously trying to get international recognition, not only on the bilateral level, but also in places like the United Nations. Just to give an example of what's been going on related to these networks, I'll give one in the case of Germany. There was a 2020 ISKP directed plot against US and NATO bases in Germany. Also in 2020, another plot was connected to a Tajik ISKP operative based in Afghanistan. The cell collected money in Germany and transferred it to financial entities in Turkey, whereby they were attempting to carry out an assassination against a critic of Islam in Albania, actually. Another cell was headed by a Russian national who has been communicating with members of ISKP in Afghanistan and helped connect another German IS supporter, Itrit P, as reported by the German government, with an ISKP operative to carry out a knife attack in Germany itself. Beyond attack plotting, authorities in various countries have also arrested ISKP members and supporters for foreign fighting recruitment, as well as fundraising in a few occasions since 2020 as well, including 2 in Britain, 4 in India, 1 in Turkey, 1 in Pakistan, and 2 cases in the United States. And in July 2023, so a couple of months ago, the U.S. Treasury Department actually designated 13 individuals in the Maldives for activity related to ISKP, including the local branch's leader, Abdullah Sharif, and its representative to Afghanistan, Ali Shafiu. Corey, you can take down the map now if you'd like. So one of the most striking aspects of ISKP's external operations network is that Tajik nationals were involved in many of its attack plots, financial schemes, and recruitment efforts, specifically in Germany, Iran, and in Turkey. Yet Tajikistan has not publicly disclosed at least anything like this activity in its own country. The situation, is, for myself, recalls the Tunisian jihadist movement, which I previously wrote a book on, prior to the country's 2011 revolution, which involved very little local activity, but major mobilization abroad to foreign fighter endeavors or facilitation and logistics in Europe. And this only became apparent after 2011. So it's something to think about for a country like Tajikistan if there's any change in political circumstances there ever in the future. It's important to state that if foreign authorities had not thwarted so many of these plots, the international community would likely be putting far more pressure on the Taliban for seemingly allowing ISKP to conduct or inspire extensive terrorist operations from its territory. Unlike in 2001, when it was allied with the problematic jihadi actor in question, al-Qaeda, the Taliban clearly regards ISKP as an enemy. Yet it is difficult to take the government's security claims seriously when it insists that foreign countries face no threats from Afghanistan. And despite its crackdown on ISKP attacks at home, terrorist plots abroad have verifiably increased in the 2 years since the Taliban took over control of the country, suggesting that the government is either unable or unwilling to contain such operations. And I'll leave it at that for now and look forward to Q&A and back and forth between everybody. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to remind our audience to please throw questions into the Q&A function on Zoom or to send an email to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to start off with a few questions. And this one is for Amir and Andrew. And I was wondering if you guys could expand on the ISK's current relationship with Central Islamic State. In the current status that it is, how has this relationship evolved, right? We talked about, in your evaluation of the propaganda, you examined how during the peak of the caliphate, it was talking about the amazingness of the caliphate, but how have we seen that change and evolve in the current status of IS Central?
I can certainly speak to one of the Amira, maybe I could take the 2015 to 17 period or so when we have a lot of information that would hopefully be useful to some of the folks in this forum about the relationship between ISK and IS Core in the startup period. And Deb, thanks for the question. It's a great question because ISK was consistently in contact with the Core, consistently receiving funds from, strategic guidance from IS Core, happily sharing all of its developments, even despite some of those targeting operations from the coalition that we mentioned, but trumpeting how they were taking in the Islamic State creed and methodology and applying it in the context of Afghanistan and Pakistan, showcasing to the Core how they were able to build new bureaucratic structures that actually emulated those of the caliphate, so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria in the peak of the caliphate period, saying, look, we've done that here. We now have a new department for managing tribal affairs. We have a new military operations bureaucratic structure that we've just appointed new leadership across. And so really being in close coordination with the Core in terms of not just the developments within the province and some of their military successes, but also justifying losses and reaching out to the Core leadership structure to say, hey, we're managing a lot of internal dissent here. We've just lost our top leader. And now we have a number of factions within the group vying for that leadership period. And we have dissenters now. How do we manage this problem? And so asking for strategic guidance from the core. So we see in that early phase, ISKOR really stepping in multiple times to support the organization, strategically guide them, provide them the financial material they needed to really step up operations. And so interestingly, that moves kind of takes a bit of a backseat in the 2018-19 2020 period. Sure, ISKOR steps in and at one point even replaces the top leadership of ISK for poor leadership performance, reportedly. But certainly less of a day-to-day activity management and providing that constant strategic guidance and updating. I think Aaron mentioned this, but it's worth noting how ISK is able to set up an independent media structure from what was otherwise a very rigid IS command and control structure for its media operations and setups. And actually, Aaron's written plenty about this, so he's probably better placed to speak to this than I am. But really, a very tight control over what the affiliates are producing and making sure that it's channeled through the core. And so the fact that ISKP over the years and more recently is able to build its own independent structure and then start disseminating across a number of regional languages. I mean, it's exploded in the last year or two. Is really telling. And so creating a bit of a separate bit of that space between itself and the core in recent years, that covers financial operations too, although it's still been receiving some support according to unit monitoring teams. But Amira, Aaron, if any additions from you, I'll turn over to you.
I'll just add a few quick points and then maybe Aaron can add some. So just to sort of add to what Andrew just said, so in the earlier years, we had access, right, to information, which was useful. But since the US withdrawal, we don't have, it's really hard to get access to any primary materials from Afghanistan, right? But I mean, there have been some sources which have noted that IS Central still continues to send money to ISK every month. And I've heard from various sources that this is in the form of cryptocurrency. Now, I haven't really looked into that myself, but there are rumors. I don't know the extent of the evidence, but it seems highly probable that at any point, now is the right time for Islamic State to actually fund one of its most successful affiliates, right? And we see this in general Islamic State propaganda, that ISK is sort of portrayed as a success story, if you can call it that, or at least a very resilient organization. And whilst we don't have access to how much control is being leveraged over ISK, there was, I think it was somewhat, and maybe perhaps in the first year under Taliban's rule, when it wasn't just the main official Islamic State Khorasan's media channel out, putting out all this material, but there were a lot of different other offshoots as well. And in subsequent months, when it sort of got out of control, we saw that there was a clampdown on all of these other additional new unofficial channels which opened up. So there is a certain level of control. There are financial relationships. Unfortunately, we don't have as much clarity as we did in earlier years for obvious reasons.
Thank you. Did you want to?
Yeah, I could just note that obviously the Islamic State has had new leadership a number of times since Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed. And each time, ISKP has renewed its pledge of allegiance to the new leader, which would suggest that they still follow orders from Iraq and Syria on some level, maybe more at the strategic level than at the tactical and operational level on a day-to-day basis. And while they do have Al-Azam media, the Islamic State's Central Media Diwan still publishes their claims of responsibility from the AFPAC region. So while maybe there's not as much tight control in the same way there may have been when IS was at its height in Iraq and Syria from say 2015 when ISKP first was founded until maybe around 2019 at the latest, there still are ties. It should be noted.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to aggregate some of the questions that have come through, and I think a lot of them have to do is where or to what does ISKP pose the greatest threat? Is it to Afghanistan? Is it to Pakistan? Is it externally? And specifically, how, pressing is this threat to Europe and the United States? Aaron, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I would imagine if you just look at the number of people that have been killed over the last, I guess, 8 years now almost, or maybe 8.5 years, most of the deaths have occurred in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I think that to the local populations is the most important thing to mention. A lot of times when we're talking about jihadi groups and these issues in general, there's a lot of navel gazing. It's very Western centric, American centric, Eurocentric. While there are plots and unfortunately attacks in our own countries, the people being affected the most are those locally where these groups are from originally. So I would say that the biggest threat is to Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Amira, Andrew, did you want to jump in?
I would agree with pretty much everything Aaron said. I said the most immediate impact is on the surrounding region, and I think in the past, it is the civilians of Afghanistan, even more than Pakistan, who have suffered. So I think the greatest danger is right there at home.
Thank you.
I'm really happy, Aaron, you brought that up because, we tend to focus, we hear external operations and we tend to think all about ourselves. And what has consistently happened over several years now is a pervasive campaign of sectarian targeting, particularly against really vulnerable populations that the former government had difficulty protecting, and certainly there's no incentive really from the Taliban to protect any of these populations, Sikh Hindus, but probably most of all in terms of the numbers and the loss of life and the trauma is the Shia Hazara communities across the region. And so I think it's important for us to really grapple with that and do as much as we can, but also to understand paradoxically that the more ISK and any IS affiliate goes after minorities and targets that, we tend to think of that as a sign of weakness, that they're going after weak, vulnerable populations and soft targets, but it builds so much strength, and the entire movement builds a lot of strength from those day by day, week by week operations against the most vulnerable, and at a local level, how that's perceived and felt is where the group builds its strength. And so that can over time paradoxically lead to greater risk externally, sure, but also locally as well. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, because we tend to dissociate those two and they're inextricably linked. And there's all that loss of life is happening locally.
Can I just add one point, I think, which we don't typically think about, is I think Western governments also have a lot more resources to simultaneously take care of their populations and fight terrorism. But when you think about governments like Pakistan, or even or any other country where ISK in South Asia is trying to establish some foothold, governments turning their attention to militancy then drains the country's resources, which provide for civilian populations in general, right? And then that creates this cycle where militants are able to exploit this sense of insecurity, create more polarization, right? And that also indirectly boosts their recruitment. So the costs go beyond just the individuals who are killed in these incidents. It's also just general, the trickle-down effect on human security in these countries.
Thank you. Our next question asks, in ISKP's international activities, how much direct involvement does the group have versus how much is inspiration or claims of allegiance to ISKP without any known links?
I think that's a really good question. It's important to disaggregate things. Obviously, when you put a big map up and just have a bunch of plots on there, there's a lot of things going on. Of course, the core of the organization is in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they've done the cross-border attacks in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. So I wouldn't say I would include that in sort of an external operations or related to fundraising or foreign fighter recruitment necessarily. So when you zoom farther out, I would say Iran and Maldives, at least based off the data we have in the open source, seem to be directed from ISKP in Afghanistan, and there are direct connections to them. And then it gets a bit more farther away, the more farther afield you go. So in Turkey, it seems like the plots are a combination of directed and guided. Whereas when you start then getting into more of the Western context, Germany, UK, US, it's more inspired with a sprinkle of maybe guided. So I think, essentially the farther away you get from Afghanistan and the core there, the less likely it is to be as connected to individuals actually based in Afghanistan than when it's closer regionally.
I'll just add that Aaron's mapping tool is a fantastic resource. I've used it myself. So thanks for I can't imagine the amount of work that's gone into putting that together. The coordination aspect is really key. And like Aaron mentioned, there's a mix of it. Think about, again, thinking locally, think about the conditions locally that are needed to facilitate that kind of environment, because there's an immense risk that comes when a local affiliate and operatives within that affiliate are taking on the risk of communicating externally and consistently guiding or directing external plots. So think about the local conditions that are necessary to create and enable that on a level that Aaron's mapping tool shows. So I would just flag that. Again, we think externally about external operations. Some of us might turn to that as it's weak, so it's turning to external operations to boost its image and its global appeal. But think about the local conditions that are needed to enable that kind of a ramp up in operational activity. So that's just one thing I would flag. And the tool is great. Thank you, Aaron.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. So several of our questions have to do with the TTP's surge in Pakistan right now. How do you think ISKP is going to respond to this? Is it going to be as an adversary as it is towards the Afghan Taliban, or do we see it perhaps outbidding or perhaps even collaborating with the group in the future? Amira.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think it's a question which is on a lot of people's minds right now. Pakistan is experiencing a big problem, a resurge in terrorism, primarily driven by, the surge is driven by the Pakistani Taliban. Of course, we have the presence of your Baloch insurgents, your sectarian groups, etc. Now, there has been a lot of pressure on the Afghan Taliban to crack down on the TTP, which they have sort of resisted until now. They're making some moves to at least display that they're taking some efforts. We'll have to see how these pan out. But historically, what we've seen is ISK has not been that aggressive against, at least in its public statements or propaganda against the TTP, right? So part of this could be rooted in the fact that the origins of ISK are in a lot of TTP leaders who broke away from the Pakistani Taliban to join or create ISK, right? So they have contributed to the rise of ISK in significant ways. So we haven't in the past seen ISK really criticizing the TTP. They have criticized the TTP whenever they have decided to engage in negotiations with the Pakistani Taliban. So I think what the future holds is a little bit complicated and is contingent upon how other actors in this environment behave. So it depends on how the TTP now reacts to the Taliban cracking down on the TTP, but it also really depends. We'll have to see how long these efforts against the TTP are sustained, right? So I think if the TTP continues its anti-Pakistan government stance, I think ISK is going to hold back on coming out against it the way it has against the Taliban. But if we see TTP being constrained and perhaps striking peace deals, I think the risk is that TTP militants will defect to ISK. They probably have friends in ISK who joined years ago, right? So I think the relationship between ISK and TTP is a little complex. Then it's cleaner relationships with other bodies where it can take a stand. You are a rival versus you're an ally. Those are strategic I think there is the potential of collaboration between individual TTP members, if it's not already happening, and ISK's members. And there's always the chance of individual factions within the TTP, which is not a very coherent organization to begin with, collaborating with ISK when it is in their interest to do so.
Could we actually get the third slide from the presentation up? I'm going to shamelessly plug, yes, the book, because we talk about this in detail in the book. But the third slide of the presentation has two really important contributions that I'm going to shamelessly plug for Amira, because she won't mention them. But the Allied and Lethal report for the West Point, Command and Terrorism Center at West Point, and then also a recent academic article that Amira published with authors called The Uninvited Guest. Maybe if we could get those out to the audience, but there's only so much we can cover in this time, and those go into great detail about exactly these dynamics and what it looks like and different types of cooperation. And oh, there we go. Thank you. They're in the top left and they're in the top right. Perfect. Check those out. Those have so much detail that are incredibly applicable to right now about TTP and other groups and how ISK builds coalitions and builds cooperation and then in turn strengthens over time. So those are two invaluable resources. Sorry, Amir. I'm just going to shamelessly plug those.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We're very, very short on time. There's so many questions that are coming in, but I'm going to ask one final one, which is, what are the steps the U.S. and its allies, including the coalition, work to counter ISKP right now? What is the most effective way of dealing with this group as it continues to expand its influence around the region? And I will let each of the speakers give a very short answer before we conclude. Aaron.
I'll begin. I think in terms of the external operations angle, it's a lot easier for each country to deal with its own law enforcement and intelligence capability within their own countries. And thus far, thankfully, there really haven't been any successful attacks besides the ones noted in Iran and the Maldives. So continue those efforts, intelligence sharing amongst allies in particular. When you start thinking about Afghanistan in particular, from an American perspective, it's very complicated. Obviously, the U.S. was fighting the Taliban for 20 years. The U.S. has a large sanctions regime essentially against the Taliban and is freezing a lot of its assets. So there's still, frosty relations. And therefore, there's not that much that the U.S. can do locally in a way where they're specifically on the ground, unless it's maybe, with human assets on the ground that are working with them through, something like the CIA or something along those lines. Therefore, I would say in terms of security to the United States and the homeland, if there's something that is a legitimate present danger and not just some activity locally that's going on that maybe the Taliban can deal with, the U.S. could do a drone strike in the same way that it did against Ayman al-Zawahiri and al-Qaeda, a year plus ago now. But I would say that that's a very limited idea and should only be done in the most dire circumstance, considering the fact that, the U.S. isn't actually there now, and therefore it complicates sovereignty issues, especially since the U.S. isn't invited to do that with the Taliban.
Andrew?
Thank you. Just three things. One, regional coordination. Regional partners are key. We mentioned this, Amir and I both mentioned this, but coordinating across the Central Asian countries and with Pakistan and other countries in the region. These are regional issues and need to be coordinated effectively. There's also, what have we learned about the Islamic State movement over the last 2 decades? 2 decades in name, certainly, but over the last 2 decades, and the legacy of previous waves of mobilization of foreign fighters contributing to successive waves. And so thinking about where are those key hotspots around the map where we have a legacy IS global issue and how those can filter into ISK in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it's a complex problem. 2, nasty work of strategic communications. I mentioned leadership turnover and other dynamics in there. This is not, it has to be done quietly, it has to be done through the right channels, and it's nasty work, but it's effective and necessary work to disrupt an organization that is trying to build momentum and cohere different affiliates within the country and certainly externally. And then finally, just local partnerships for us in the West, in the United States and our European allies, to those who are on the call. We've learned a lot over the last 2 decades. We've built relationships at whole of the society level. And so leveraging those have led to some successes already against ISIS-K inspired and directed plots, as Aaron mentioned, from what he presented. So those 3 things. Thank you.
And finally, Amira.
All right, since we have 0 minutes left, I will. I can only add to what my esteemed colleagues have said here. I think they covered a lot of ground. The only thing I would say is the regional governments perhaps could be facilitated in some way by not just the U.S. but other Western countries who are concerned about ISK's ability to at least mobilize individuals already in Europe or the US, right? So facilitating cooperation between these countries along the counterterrorism, counterinsurgency angle doesn't have to be broader, but I think also local governments need to identify that their approach of just going after the 1 militant or 2 militant groups, which are an immediate threat to their governments, is not going to work anymore, because we have so much evidence that these groups have realized, if they hadn't already, that a networked approach is the best way to survive, right? So we have to target the network as it exists, which allows these individuals to survive and expand in new ways. That's what has to be dismantled. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to our amazing speakers. Thank you to our audience who asked more questions than we had time to get to. It was such a great event. We didn't have time to get to all these questions. I'd like to remind our audience that this will be on our website later, along with a summary of the event. I'd like to thank each of our speakers and once again, give a shout out to this amazing book, which hopefully you all purchase. And thank you so much for joining us today in this lecture of the Counterterrorism Lecture